we're resuming our lectures on the history of Vietnam. Are the matters arising from the last class that you want to bring up?
Yeah, I have a question in regards to the essay.
Yes.
Do you want it uploaded? You want it uploaded to Learn? I was looking in the assignments folder and I don't see like the submission location yet. So I'm just wondering, is that going to be updated?
Okay, I'll make sure that that's updated and you'll be able to upload it. Okay.
All right, and I just have a second question. Is it due tomorrow?
No, Friday. Friday.
It's due Friday. All right, thank you.
Friday, let's say Friday at 9 o'clock in the evening. Okay. Any other questions about this?
Is that 9 a.m. or 9 p.m.?
9 p.m.
Okay.
I also have a question about the essay. What sources should we be using for it? Just the kind of video?
My lectures and the whatever reading you've done in the text, and the first episode of Vietnam, a television history, which is easily available on Google.
Okay, thanks.
Anything else? I want you to look at the documentary because, well, it's a good introduction and it gives you a flavor of especially the French period. So with that, then we do have on the 15th. What I'm going to do is I'm going to be reviewing. Starting in a few days, I'll start a review of the review questions. I'll go over the review questions and sort of give you a good sense of what I'm looking for in the way of an answer and sort of prep you for the exam. Then on the 15th, I'll be giving out, or I'll be listing, I'll send you all an email with asking you to write. I'll have 3 questions and you write the answers to 2 of them as your midterm exam. And the same procedure uploading to Learn. So, okay, that takes care of the assignment. If there's any further question, just email me and we can converse. So today things get exciting because the narrative is about the overthrow of the Diem government. And you remember how I spent time describing how they put this together with American help and so on, and then this rural insurgency from 56 onwards begins to become more and more serious. And then I guess in the course of last lecture, I noted the fact that Diem's repression didn't simply extend to the countryside with the agrovilles and so on, the attempt to recover rent for the landlords, but in the cities, his oppression was keenly felt, and so we saw that there was this so-called Caravel Manifesto in April 1960. People who, some of them had been cabinet ministers in Diem's government and so on. Others more liberally minded. They met together in this hotel, issued a manifesto, which they read out in a press conference, and they denounced the arbitrary arrests of the regime, the detentions, these detention camps. They said the elections that Diem allowed were fixed, fraudulent, and so on, and they called for a liberalization of the regime. This is in April, and then I noted that in November, the army, actually the commanders in the army, many of them became involved in an attempted coup against Diem. And the coup almost succeeded, but these generals didn't have much political experience, and so they weren't able to follow through. They didn't have clear political objectives, how to actually carry through a coup d'état. So Diem was able to rally some loyal troops. He still had the support of the Americans, and the coup was defeated. However, Diem was really scared, and in particular, he noted the fact that a lot of the coup plotters had been close to the Americans, and it was true that the growing presence of American military advisors, these people, they were openly critical of the authoritarianism of Diem, and the fact that he was a kind of traditionalist. All of what he did was in the name of sort of traditional Vietnam values and so on. And the Americans talked about modernizing Vietnamese society, modernizing Vietnamese government and the military. And Diem felt that the Americans, by this means, would the American influence would undermine the loyalty of the army. And so he began to, and he was a nationalist, and he felt that the Americans really were pushing for control. And so he began to resist them more and more. So that's the overall evolution of things. And the main thing that I think is happening is the rural insurgency. You have to keep that in mind. That's growing in the background. A political crisis develops in Saigon and Hue in the north, but underneath it is this what to do about the rural insurgency is the main problem. So meanwhile, there's big change in the United States because the Eisenhower administration is replaced by the Democrats. The Democrats win the election of 1960, and the Republicans ran the Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, or as he was otherwise called, Tricky Dick. And there was John F. Kennedy. You know, he's legendary. What can I say? He was a movie star. I actually saw him. I was visiting Washington. I went to the Capitol and was watching the proceedings and in the Senate from the gallery. And Kennedy walked in and he was extraordinary. He was literally a movie star, tanned and so on and young. And America never had a president like that, quite like this. And it was a kind of Hollywood presidency, so that's the way I would present it. But actually, in Kennedy's mind, in some ways, he very much bought into the sort of Cold War mentality, the Cold War conception of the world, the notion of a monolithic communism, the necessity to contain this communism, the notion of Vietnam as a domino, the importance of constantly shoring up Japan, the importance of Vietnam and Southeast Asia to Japan. In other words, that framework that I outlined earlier, he was completely on board with that. But it's important to note that in the communist world, there were important changes which he might have been aware of. Maybe he knew about these things, but they were on the periphery of his view of the world. And the main thing was that the idea of a monolithic communism, this was no longer true. That, in fact, by 1960, 61, there was open conflict between the Soviet Union and Mao's China, between China and the Soviet Union. And in fact, a virtual split had developed. It was based partly on the fact that the Russians were basically eager to pursue a policy of peaceful coexistence. Their society had recovered from World War II. They didn't want war, and there was a kind of stabilization. And the elite that controlled the Soviet Union now wanted basically continuity, stability. They had certain privileges. Meanwhile, Mao's revolution was continuing. There had been in the 50s a campaign known as the Great Leap Forward, and looking ahead in the 1960s, as we'll see, there was something called the Cultural Revolution, and so the Maoist revolutionary change was continuing in China. And you see that right at the moment we see I'm not saying that we're going back to Maoism, but in China there is a very significant change of direction. You can get a sense of this, for example, if you go to David Harvey on YouTube. If you put in David Harvey China on YouTube, David Harvey has a half hour in which he describes what's going on right now in China, and you'll understand what I'm talking about. In any case, why am I mentioning this? Because when my argument is that Kennedy basically led the United States into this full-scale intervention, which turned into a disaster. And rather than that, he might have pursued, to his advantage, the split between China and Russia that had already developed. And the more so as because when all of this, the American policies fell apart, that was exactly the policy that Nixon, who became president after the Democratic president, Kennedy, of course, was killed, Johnson took over. When Johnson was ousted, Nixon took over, and that's exactly the policy that he pursued. That is to say, using China to counterbalance Russia, and it proved to be a very successful policy, as we'll see. I mean, no policy lasts forever. Nixon's policy has broken down now, but back then it was quite a brilliant stroke that diplomatic revolution. But Kennedy, his mind was completely into the Cold War and so on. Now, in fact, Kennedy had been a founding member of the American Friends of Vietnam, this lobby group that I talked about. He was an enthusiastic backer of Diem in the beginning, and moreover, he was very confrontational in foreign policy. During the campaign against Nixon in 1960, he basically said that the Eisenhower administration, which he was running against, were too soft on the Soviet Union, and that he said that, in fact, the Soviet Union was getting ahead of the United States in the arms race. In particular, he emphasized what the so-called missile gap. He said that the Soviet Union was building more nuclear missiles than the United States. This was not true, but he said it anyway. And so his personal style also was he was aggressive, he was confrontational, he was feisty, let's put it that way. And this was demonstrated by, this idea that we should take the fight to the communists was demonstrated by the fact that, of course, in '59, Cuba had had its revolution. By 1961, it had become essentially a communist revolution, and picking up a plan already developed by Eisenhower, he gave the signal for an invasion of Cuba. This is the famous invasion of the Bay of Pigs, April 1961. And it was a fiasco. The invasion failed. Castro rallied his troops and defeated the invaders. And Kennedy, he, at the last minute, refused to give substantial support to the Cuban insurgents. And so they were defeated, which was a big humiliation for Kennedy. And then following that, of course, there was the next year, the Soviets secretly attempted to install missiles in Cuba. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that was an attempt to basically protect Cuba from the Americans' war-preparing plans for subsequent invasions and so on. So Khrushchev, in a bold move, tried to install missiles on the island, and Kennedy responded with all-out mobilization. And we know that this was the closest during the Cold War and ever since that the world has actually come to a nuclear war. Who knows? It could happen again. The danger of this nuclear confrontation is still very much with us, but this was really serious. People were scared. I was scared, like everybody was scared. That passed over. So, but meanwhile, Kennedy had to really deal with the fact that, especially when Castro took over, revolution was spreading in the third world. Imitating Cuba became, especially amongst young people in the third world, this is what people wanted to do: get out from under Western domination. And so in many, many countries, especially in Latin America, there were revolutionary movements. There were also those in Africa, particularly. Those were the two hotspots at this time. So what was America going to do? How would they respond? Well, in terms of Latin America, where there were about 11 revolutionary movements by 1961, guerrilla movements, there was a kind of romance of the guerrilla, especially Castro. And of course, Che Guevara was really caught up in this, and he eventually ended up in Bolivia and died. Well, Kennedy responded in the first place by launching what he called the Alliance for Progress. Alliance for Progress 1961, which was a plan of, they were going to give $20 billion to build up the middle class in Latin America. And the middle class in Latin America, with the help of American advisors, would modernize the economies of all these Latin American countries, and this would undercut the elan, the momentum of revolutionary movements. That was one thing, but the other thing was that Kennedy, he was the central figure in developing the counterinsurgency in the third world. Counterinsurgency is the keynote. And in particular, there was the idea of elite American troops known as the Green Berets, these counter guerrillas. It's still, of course, this is a big business. especially in the United States, but other countries also have the Green Berets, including Canada. I don't even want to get into what Canada is up to, and what it's up to is no good. But nevertheless, this Green Beret concept, this is a product of this period. But also, in order to improve, the guerrillas moved amongst the population. And I talked about the People's War and the fact that if you have popular support in the countryside, you can basically move freely. You have a certain tactical mobility and so on. Well, the answer was certainly the Green Berets, but also helicopters, the massive use of helicopters to search out the enemy, and in the, so sort of hiding in the countryside, and also using helicopters to ferry in counterinsurgency troops. You bring in the guerrillas are moving here and there, and as soon as you spot them, you radio in 50, 100 helicopters ferrying in troops, and you attack, and you search out and you destroy the guerrillas. This was the idea. So economic programs, but also counterinsurgency warfare. And one other aspect of this that needs to be stressed is the fact that there was an ideology behind all of this. And that was the ideology of what we call modernization, in answer to the idea that the only solution for third world people was revolution and socialism, which was the communist idea. The Americans advanced the idea that that was wrong, that was counterproductive, and class war, and that's the key, was a bad thing. You needed a middle class. So the idea was rapid modernization, but without class war, without class conflict. That was the essence of the American idea of modernization. And the key person in this, from this perspective, was, no, this is not right. I'll use his name, I'll put it on. A guy by the name of Walt Rostow. Walt Rostow, who wrote a book called The Stages of Economic Growth, published. Kennedy read it. It was actual title was The Stages of Economic Growth, a non-communist manifesto. You've heard of the Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx. Well, Rostow wrote a non-communist manifesto, and this was the Bible of modernization theory. That is to say, if you build modern infrastructure in a third world country, lay down roads and communication systems, you build a modern education system, you build a modern administrative system, you can basically you can have economic growth, and people will benefit from this. This was basically the theory of modernization, and certainly that's what the Americans attempted to apply all over the third world, including in Vietnam, because in Vietnam, they actually commissioned the political science department of the University of Michigan State University, and the name of the individual was Wesley Fischel. He was in the political science department, and commissioned. He was commissioned to basically modernize the whole administrative structure of the South Vietnamese state, Diem state. Remember, I said he was a traditionalist. Well, they brought in Fischel to modernize the police, modernize the state administration, modernize the finances, and draw up a plan for infrastructure. And they gave Michigan State University millions of dollars. This was, of course, this is going on throughout the universities in the United States. They were very dependent on research money coming from the government, and particularly from the Defense Department. And of course, when everything exploded on the campuses, the anti-war movement developed, and the students went through the records of their universities and discovered this. This was dynamite. The administrators were exposed as being complicit with all these. Some of these programs were terrible. There was one at the University of Manitoba that I won't go into, but it was a real scandal, and it went on, just about everywhere. So anyway, this was the program of how to deal with the communist threat in the third world, which was seen as the key area of struggle. Now, the question is, why did Kennedy, and then subsequently why did Johnson see the struggle in Indochina, and in particular in Vietnam, as key to the situation? And the answer is, it was strategically, the Americans reached the conclusion, if they could deal with the situation in Vietnam, they could deal with the problem of third world revolution anywhere. Because in the first place, there was the peasant insurgency that I described. And so bringing that under control, usually using the measures that I suggested, was one thing. But at the same time, if you could control the situation there, you could contain China. And remember how much significance I gave to the idea of containing the growth of communism in Southeast Asia was so central to American policy. So suppressing revolution in Indochina and in Vietnam would be killing two birds with one stone. You would contain China, and you would demonstrate the American capacity to suppress revolution and control revolution in the third world. And this, of course, when I talk about Kennedy and so on, you have to understand that America was really feeling its oats at this period. America was at the height of the prosperity of the post-war during the Eisenhower period, and especially under John Kennedy. They felt there was no limit to what they could do. They could do anything. And they had limitless capacity. At the same time, internally, the American public, certainly at the beginning of the Kennedy administration, was solidly behind this, including the working people, because the prosperity extended to them. This was a period of what we can call class compromise, based on consumerism, on consumerist capitalism. And so the American working class was quiescent. They thought the United States was the greatest country in the world, and so on, and highly patriotic, and so on. And so the government had huge backing. All the public opinion polls showed that. And so launching adventures is basically what I'm saying, was possible. I would say that the situation has changed, that today there's a huge distrust. And one of the things that these administrations in Washington have to be very careful about is getting involved in some sort of a ground war, some sort of a blow up in a place like Latin America where it doesn't go well. And this feeds the already great discontent within American society. It could, Vietnam produced a huge backfire, and some other event. The situation is much more explosive today. So there you are. Anyway, the focal point in the wake, based on this description, the focal point of the conflict actually, at this moment, when Kennedy was consolidating his power in Washington, wasn't Vietnam itself. It was the neighboring and more remote country of Laos. Remember, I explained there's China to the north, and then there's Indochina, and Indochina is made up of Vietnam, but also Cambodia, and in the northwest, to the west of Dien Bien Phu, lies the remote kingdom of Laos, which is a much smaller country, just several million people, all of whom are peasants. It's much less developed than Vietnam. The people are simple rural peasants, so on. I explained that, in fact, when the Communist Party in Indochina was formed in 1931, it was the Indochina Communist Party. It wasn't the Vietnam Communist Party, because they included Laos and Cambodia with Vietnam in the Indochina Communist Party, because there was virtually no politics in Laos. It was a really backward traditional society. It had a king, it was Buddhist and so on, but the modernity has scarcely touched this place. There were a few merchants from Thailand, and also there were some Vietnamese who lived in Laos, who were traders, or maybe traders, merchants, or craftsmen, and that's about it. And Laos was also very mountainous, hilly country. A lot of it was covered with jungle and so on. So that was the situation. But nevertheless, in 1951, as you recall, the three elements of the Communist Party separated. There was the Khmer Communist Party in Cambodia, the Vietnamese Communist Party, and the Laotian one, known as the Pathet Lao Liberation. And it started in 1951 as an independent movement, and by 1961 it had become significant, along with, of course, the Vietnamese, the National Liberation Front, and the Communist Party or the Labor Party in Vietnam. And the thing was that in Laos, this backward country, there was a royal army. The king had an army, but it was worthless, this army. And the Pathet Lao became stronger and stronger. And indeed, in 1961, there was an all-out battle in Laos between the royalist troops and the Pathet Lao, somewhere in the northern part of the country near the Chinese border. And the royalist troops were completely defeated. There was no army left. And all of the government officials began to flee into Thailand. A communist takeover of Laos was imminent. So at this point, Kennedy goes on television and basically he threatens all-out American intervention in Laos to prevent this. But he's perfectly aware, his advisors tell him, listen, this is close to China, very close to China, and also it's jungle and mountain. You don't want to fight a war in such a situation. And Kennedy agrees. And so he contacts Moscow, and Moscow, pursuing its policy of peaceful coexistence, agrees that Laos should be neutralized. This crisis in Laos blows up in 1961, but it's lenified, it's softened by a mutual agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States. And the thing is that in the wake of that, Kennedy comes under criticism from the Republicans and so on of being soft. And moreover, it's his disposition. He's going to show that the Americans can triumph by supporting Diem and by making a serious effort in Vietnam. So what I'm saying is the outcome of the Laotian crisis is to stiffen Kennedy's resolve in terms of Vietnam. And so more and more military advisors and pilots, especially pilots of these helicopters, which are more and more being sent to Vietnam to deal with the National Liberation Front insurgency. You get a gradual buildup of course, they're giving the ARVN, the South Vietnamese Army, tons of military equipment, but in addition, they're sending in these advisors and helicopter pilots into the situation. And as one historian puts it, I'm just quoting him now, he says, militarization in the sense of American involvement in combat was incremental, but it was not accidental. Despite initial public assurances to the contrary, it was quite calculated. And by military intervention, he means that these helicopter pilots, these Green Berets who were advising the ARVN, but themselves, they were, not only did they advise them, they began to fight the National Liberation Front. And so there was a buildup of this growing American involvement. And indeed, by the time that Kennedy died, we're now in 61, he died in November 1963. By the time of his death in November 63, there were some 16,000 American military advisors advising, but also fighting in South Vietnam. Kennedy was spurred to action by reports that the rural insurgency was growing and growing. By April 61, a report given to him said that there were no less than 58% of South Vietnam was already under communist control. 58% was already under communist control. Now, what this really means is that the old insurgency, the Viet Minh, already had control of most of the country, is what I'm saying. So the structure that had been created by the Viet Minh in the villages had been revived. This is and you also have more and more military combat going on in the rural areas. So it's the old Viet Minh structure, which has come back to life, essentially, in the rural areas. This is what's really going on. So he gets this report, 58% of South Vietnam is under communist control. But really, what it is the Viet Minh have come back. They've resurfaced. Well, the thing is that he also then learns that the whole of the Mekong Delta, the southern Cochin, which I explained earlier, is on the verge of falling to the communists. While Kennedy is introducing more and more these American military elements of the situation, Diem is becoming increasingly alarmed. He's alarmed that he's losing control. The Americans are taking over, and moreover, he says, and I think quite legitimately, that the Americans are replacing the French here, and we want to be an independent country. Nationalism. He appeals to nationalism. He is himself a nationalist, although a nationalist traditionalist. But he's saying the Americans are just coming back and taking over where the French left off. and there's obviously a certain truth to what is being said. Now, so the Americans are pouring in supplies. The American attitude is that Diem is an old fogey. You know, he's a Mandarin. He doesn't understand modernity, and we're stuck with him. We backed him. We actually would want a regime that was more open, more modern, more liberal. There was a kind of a National Assembly. There were sort of liberal politicians around. These are the guys the Americans would have preferred to deal with, but they were stuck with Diem, is what I'm saying. Well, this was the situation. So we started out in 61. In 62, things begin to go a little bit better. There is a certain, because the Americans pour in so much money into the situation, and they also give the ARVN, these armored personnel carriers, that is to say, basically transport trucks, which are armored, heavily armored. The troops are inside the trucks, and they can go anywhere. They can go across swamps even. They move very quickly. And that, combined with the helicopter operations and the use of a lot of increasing amounts of napalm from the air, throws the communists off balance. And so 62, things seem to be going better. The Americans even revived the Agroville program. Remember these compounds that Diem tried to put the peasants in? Well, the Americans step up this. They call it the Strategic Hamlet program, and it seems to be working. They put a lot of the peasants into these compounds and cut them off from the insurgents. So that is also going on. On the other hand, a weak point that needs to be mentioned, because it helps to set off the anti-war movement, is the way all of this is being reported back in the United States. Obviously, this war is developing, and the American press are sending reporters to report this conflict in Indochina. The administration, the Kennedy administration, and then the Johnson administration that followed, was unable to control the American press. This is, in terms of keeping public opinion on board, you need to keep control of the way a war is being conducted. You have to control if you want public support. You want to minimize losses and play up successes. Well, the Americans had done that, a thorough job of that in World War II and in the Korean War. And they did a pretty good job in Iraq. And we're talking about the recent time, and in Afghanistan. People were taken by surprise by the fact that Afghanistan collapsed overnight. That was because the real situation was not being reported. The press in Afghanistan were under thorough American control. So basically it was all propaganda. But they couldn't do that in Vietnam, or they didn't know how to do it. TV was a new thing, the development of TV reporting, and the news was very important. And the news every night was broadcasting back. The reporters were broadcasting honest accounts of really the corruption, the bribery, the incompetence, and the failures of the South Vietnamese government and army on a nightly basis. Now, Kennedy did make efforts. He called up the head of NBC, the National Broadcasting Company, said, listen, stop reporting this critical stuff. So the head of NBC said, yes, sir. And they did that, but they couldn't do the same thing with the New York Times, for example. That was the leading, still is, leading newspaper in the United States. Their reporters were reporting things honestly in the way I would suggest. They were by no means on the side of the communists. On the contrary, most of these reporters were liberals. Kennedy was a liberal, but they had cooperated with Washington at the Bay of Pigs. They knew that the Kennedy was going to invade the Bay of Pigs, but out of loyalty, the New York Times did not report this, that the upcoming invasion. And in retrospect, they said, this was a mistake. We're going to report everything. And so the New York Times and some of the other leading journals kept reporting the incompetence of the government and the army, the corruption, the authoritarianism. It was all being reported. And it was undermining public support. And as things went from bad to worse, the reporting became more and more critical, undermining Washington's efforts to win in Vietnam. Now, the real beginning of this, these problems occurred in a big battle south of Saigon, 50 miles south of Saigon. There's a place known as Ap Bok, and this was a village. The National Liberation Front was very strong around there, and the Americans were patrolling, and they discovered a regiment of National Liberation Fronts at Ap Bok. So they immediately dispatched 800 armed troops, backed up by armored personnel carriers, planes, napalm, American advisors. They surround the Ap Bok, and a pitched battle, 800 ARVN backed up by American military, and 120 National Liberation Front troops. And it turns into a disaster. The ARVN lose about 180 troops killed and wounded, and 14 helicopters are shot down by these 120 National Liberation, or Viet Cong, if you can call them, National Liberation Front troops. And at the end of the day, the ARVN is so bloody that they just let the remnants of the National Liberation Front fighters escape. Well, all of this is reported. This is a disaster. And it's followed up by several other battles in which things go badly, and it's all reported. The main thing is that the communist side, the Viet Cong, have learned to deal with the American helicopters. That's the key thing. They, at first, in '62, they were terrified of this, the approach of these scores and sometimes hundreds of helicopters. But they figured out a counter strategy, and so this was serious. But the Washington administration said, well, this was really a victory because the communists withdrew. And nobody believed it. It was not credible. So where are we? We still have a little bit of time. The Kennedy administration kept up this optimistic thing, but Diem, meanwhile, was the Americans were getting involved. He feared of a coup, and he kept saying, "We don't want more American involvement." The Americans said, "You need American involvement," and elements of the South Vietnamese army also were demanding more American commitment. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Kennedy had to deal with public opinion. And indeed, some politicians who had once been big supporters, like Mike Mansfield, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, this is the key committee in Congress, he issued a report saying the situation is getting worse and we should get out, withdraw. So Kennedy calls Mansfield in and he says, yes, I'm going to get out, but I can't do this before the next election, November 64, because the Republicans will just kill me. So I need to stay there until the next election. So the big question, and this is what I'm going to conclude on, is would Kennedy have basically gotten out? And there are lots of people who believe that. They want to believe that in the Kennedy myth. They want to believe that this guy was Mr. Golden and he would have gotten out. That's not my view, but many people, some of them on the left, they believe that Kennedy was great and he could do no wrong because he was beautiful. But we'll go into this next time, and we'll see how Diem was destroyed, basically. A big crisis developed, particularly the Buddhist crisis. The Buddhists revolted against Diem, and that was the end of it. So we'll see this next time.
Professor,
Yes.
I just have a quick question about the assignment. You said it's due on Friday, October the 8th, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I just want to make sure. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Do you want it to be 2 pages double spaced or single spaced for the assignment?
I'm not going to. Your problem is going to be how to be as concise as possible. How, this could, in writing the essay, the trick is to sort of figure out how to write a 2-page essay on maybe a little bit complicated issue. We have to write more. So limiting the amount of material that you're going to produce is the real difficult. Not how long, but whether you can keep it two pages is the limit. So that's my response. Okay.
Is if you go slightly over, is that okay or no?
Of course,
Like it
of
has
course.
to be under 2.
Of
no matter
course,
what.
no. I'm not uptight. Some people say I'm uptight, but I don't believe it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.